in the words of the Chinese, for being unpatriotic. These members were standing up for the liberty and the freedom in a process that they supported, and they were denied. In January 2021, 53 Hong Kong Democrats and activists were charged under the national security law for participating in an unofficial democratic primary election in 2020. 47 of these 53 activists, known as the Hong Kong 47, are currently on trial in Hong Kong, charged under the national security law. This is the largest national security law trial to date, and it gives an idea of the ferocity of the Chinese against people who just want liberty. Hong Kong's rule of law and judicial system continue to be destroyed under the national security law. There are more than 1,400 political prisoners in Hong Kong. Hong Kong holds the highest proportion of women political prisoners in the world. Should we not be concerned about that? I think we are, and we're here today to reiterate that as well. Foreign judges, including Lord Reid and Lord Hodge from the UK, have left Hong Kong because they do not want to legitimise the current administration, which continues to crush Hong Kong's most basic of civil liberties. In fact, it's been said that it is immoral, and it is, that any British judge or foreign judges should sit in Hong Kong courts, regardless of how much they're being paid. So I urge again our Minister and our government to ensure that no British judge sits on the Hong Kong courts and profits from the current turmoil in that international city of Hong Kong. We've all discussed previously the case of Jimmy Lai, as right honourable other members have reiterated today and will reiterate shortly, who has been a British citizen, who is a British citizen, and who has been prevented from having his lawyer of choice, even when it comes to legal opinion, his right has been denied. The number of district council seats that are democratically chosen now sit at around 20%. There are clearly issues, and I look to the Minister to ascertain how we can be part of addressing these outrages and attacks upon democracy. Hong Kong authorities continue to erode the freedom of the press. On Reporters Without Borders 2023 World Press Freedom Index, it's poor reading, Sir George, Hong Kong was ranked 140 out of 180 countries. In 2022, Hong Kong fell nearly 70 places from the previous year, exposing, I believe, the grave impact of the national security law that the right honourable member has referred to. Hong Kong is not the global financial hub the world once knew. According to an Atlantic Council report that assesses the risks in Hong Kong's business environment, when journalists' right to report freely is threatened, all forms of reporting, including those relating to the state of financial markets, may be impacted. So therefore, it will have an impact clearly upon the financial market, and it has. Companies cannot thrive in that type of environment, and they're speaking with their feet. The Atlantic Council also raised concerns regarding the privacy of corporate data and intellectual property rights of companies who continue to operate in and from Hong Kong. The influence of Chinese authorities is detrimentally impacting upon their business. I'm of an opinion that government should do more to warn businesses and business people of the risks they face by working and investing in Hong Kong due to national security laws. So can the Minister, ever mindful that he's not the Minister directly responsible, give a response in this place to that question today? And prior to the passage of the national security law in June 2020, former Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said that the national security law would violate Hong Kong's one country, two systems principle. After its passage, a statement was made affirming that the China-imposed national security law caused China to break its promise to Hong Kong that it would be able to govern itself, and breached its international commitments to Britain under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Quite clearly, international law has been broken by China as well. In the British government's latest six-monthly report on Hong Kong in May 2023, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, urged Beijing to heed a call from an independent United Nations Human Rights Council report to remove the Beijing-imposed national security law in Hong Kong. What has happened since then? I suspect very little, but the question has been posed by the right honourable gentleman in his introduction, and is posed by myself as well. During Parliament questions on human rights in Hong Kong just last year, Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon from the other place said that Hong Kong authorities' decision to target leading pro-democracy figures, including Cardinal Sen, Margaret Nye, Hu Peng Keong and Denise Ho under the national security law is clearly unacceptable. And there seems to be a disregard totally by the Chinese authorities for what is happening. Since the passage of the national law in 2020, the British government has referred to the national security law as a violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. I welcome the fact that British and Canadian governments have offered generous visa schemes, and government is to be congratulated on those schemes to Hong Kongers to allow them to escape from the oppressive consequences of the national security law. Again, maybe the Minister, in his summing up, could give us some idea how we are working along with our allies, Canada, United States, and indeed other countries, to represent the Hong Kongers. While international support is welcome, it is quite clearly, Sir George, not enough. Hong Kong continues to deteriorate day by day. Freedom is less today than it was the last time we had a debate. I think it was about 3 months ago, and indeed, when we go back even further, a year ago. We must and we have to do more to protect the Hong Kongers who have moved to the UK and face harassment and intimidation from the Chinese Communist Party, including through the Confucius Institutes and British University. I had some of my constituents who are good friends of mine. I've known them for many, many years, who were clearly being tracked, regulated, and monitored on what they were doing. Now, the Minister, the day we asked that question, the information was sent on, and the police forces and the PSNI in particular are aware of that. But the fact is that it can happen is quite distressing for my constituents, and certainly distressing for me as their elected representative. In conclusion, Sir George, I am asking the Minister to call for the release of British citizen Jimmy Lai. Right on, my member has said it, others will say it. It's clearly one of our key demands from this debate today and from our Minister and from our government. He's been behind bars for 910 days. To continue to place pressure on the Hong Kong government to immediately repeal the national security law and clearly also speak out against legislation in Hong Kong that continues to destroy the rule of law, continues to destroy the judicial system, the free press, and the vibrant financial centre the world once knew. Quite clearly, from my point of view, Sir George, today we have a chance to once again make a plea on behalf of Jimmy Lai and all of those who have been detained by the Chinese authorities and who we have a duty, I believe, in this House to represent to the fullest of our capabilities. Thanks very much.
I mean, Green.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I should start by congratulating my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, not just on securing the debate on this grim but important anniversary, but also for such a powerful and compelling speech, making the case that we in this country, and perhaps specifically the government, should be doing more than has been done in the last few years to push back against what the Chinese government is doing under the guise of their national security law in Hong Kong and indeed around the world, not least in this country. But I should say that the government has done some good things. I congratulate them on the introduction of the BNO visa route for Hong Kong citizens. Unquestionably, this was a positive development. It provides an opportunity for BNO status holders and their families to live, work and study here in the UK. And the figures speak for themselves. We've had a total of more than 160,000 applications since it was first introduced 2.5 years ago. And I'm afraid that figure shows how essential it was for those who no longer feel their way of life is safe in Hong Kong. And I'm particularly grateful that the scheme was further open to younger Hong Kong people following a campaign I worked on with others who are present today. Not least because, as my right honourable friend said in his opening remarks, those who were born after 1997 are in many ways the most vulnerable to the Chinese government's crackdown in Hong Kong. And of course, until the government agreed to change the law, they were ineligible under the original scheme. So those are both positive steps. I don't want to be unremittingly negative. But I must point out that the BNO scheme is no substitute for holding Beijing accountable across the board. We can all see the routine answer to questions about Hong Kong is, in this place, the government says it will not shirk from its responsibilities to Hong Kong people and our commitments under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And the supporting evidence the government always brings out is the BNO scheme, and so far, nothing else. And I think we need to be clear in this House that allowing Hong Kongers to come to the UK doesn't hold Beijing accountable for breaking international agreements with the UK. So I'd be grateful if in his concluding speech, my honourable friend, the Minister, could say what concrete action has been taken to hold the Chinese government accountable for what the UK government calls ongoing breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is supposed to remain in force for another 24 years. Have they, for example, registered any formal objection for Joint Declaration breaches, as is provided under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties? I must say, stepping back a second, that I'm something of a heretic in that I wince slightly when the House of Commons demands that the British government and Foreign Office ministers take a stand and do something about practically every crisis that emerges around the world, many of which the British government has no locus to intervene in. However, in this case, we absolutely do. We signed this treaty. So this is a genuine British government issue, and not just some kind of emotional attachment to democracy around the world, which of course we all have. And the phrase the government likes to use is robust pragmatism. And if that means anything, it must mean ensuring that those who break binding international agreements with us aren't simply permitted to get away with it. We've had some discussion already about Hong Kongers in the UK. And it's worth pointing out that this is the largest peacetime migration to the UK from outside Europe in history. The Uganda lifeboat scheme, set up to assist those who were fleeing Idi Amin, reached around 28,000 people. The Hong Kong scheme, as I said, is already at 160,000. And that scheme, the Ugandan scheme, came with a well-crafted integration plan. As recent conflicts between Hong Kongers and the mainland Chinese authorities in this country have shown, like the shocking attack on Southampton University students earlier this month, full integration of Hong Kong people isn't without difficulty. So I'd be interested to hear what efforts are being made to ensure that Hong Kong people feel safe in this country. How does the government plan to address the issue of Chinese state-sponsored intimidation, like that we saw again mentioned earlier, perpetrated by the Chinese Consul General in Manchester on our soil? And I'm sure the Minister agrees with me that Hong Kong people are entitled to the same rights as the rest of us in the UK and must not feel as if their right to assembly and protest is somehow curtailed due to the Chinese government's intimidation techniques and transnational repression. We must remain vigilant and responsive to what will be the evolving needs of this growing constituency of fellow citizens, as fellow residents of this country. So I hope the government will continue to engage with BNO holders, the relevant organisation and the experts to develop policies that address their broader challenges beyond visa provisions. We owe it to these brave individuals to provide them with the necessary support and opportunities to thrive in the UK. We've had much discussion of the Jimmy Lai case, and I know that many of them feel unsafe in the wake of that case travelling. They fear that the UK, frankly, will not defend them if Beijing attempts to apprehend them in China, Hong Kong, or even a third country from which they may be extradited. So again, I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out the government's policy regarding Hong Kong BNO holders when they're travelling outside this country. It's also worthwhile the government considering a discrepancy in our approach to these people. It's not well known that Commonwealth citizens who do not require leave to remain in the UK are eligible to stand for Parliament. And in correspondence with Luke de Pulford of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China last year, the former Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the member for Whittam, confirmed that this didn't extend to Hong Kong people due to a now obsolete rule associated with an annex to the Joint Declaration, in spite of Hong Kong people having been in the same category as Commonwealth countries previously for the purposes of immigration law. And many of these 160,000 people are already engaged with political parties in the UK. And it feels wrong that these people will be excluded from representative politics for another 5 years. So I hope the Minister can agree to look at that. And one last individual case that I think the government should consider is Andy Lee. He was one of 12 Hong Kongers who tried to flee Hong Kong in a boat in August 2020. All were apprehended and taken to Shenzhen prison. We don't know what happened there, but it was sufficiently awful to have persuaded Andy to testify against Jimmy Lai, a man he's never met. Andy has now been transferred to Hong Kong, where he was convicted for collusion with foreign forces, but still hasn't been sentenced. And it seems that the authorities will not sentence him until he's testified at Jimmy Lai's trial, underlying the depths to which a once proud legal system has now sunk. Andy Lee is a courageous, non-violent Hong Konger whose only crime was to work to defend the promises set out in the Joint Declaration and Basic Law. He's now in prison precisely because we failed to keep the Chinese government to their promises. Indeed, those who have been sanctioned by the Chinese government, some of them, including my honourable friend, the member for the Isle of Wight, and the noble Lord Alton of Liverpool, were mentioned in Andy Lee's case file as an example of the foreign forces with which he is supposed to have colluded. And it was on this basis that all those figures were warned by the Foreign Office of extradition to China, as they're likely seen as criminal under the national security law, which claims universal jurisdiction even over foreign nationals. So again, I hope the Minister can agree with me that this House and the government can't stand by while people are imprisoned because of entirely legitimate work with members of this place, and agree to redouble their efforts to see Andy Lee freed. I appreciate the difficulties ministers face in maintaining a position of robust pragmatism, but it is incumbent on them to defend the rule of law and international treaties, and that they need to defend that position consistently and over a long period. That would be in the best traditions of the British government and the British people, and I think we owe it to Hong Kongers to maintain the robust part of robust pragmatism for as long as it takes.
So, George, thank you. I wasn't intending to speak in this debate, but my right honourable friend and fellow sanctionee has spurred me on to fill this short gap that we may have in this debate, because there's rarely a debate on China that happens in this place, and I'm not chafing at the bit to participate in it. And I agree with everything that my right honourable friends have said, and I won't repeat that. Certainly the generosity and the necessity of the BNO scheme has shown its worth, and I fear there will be many more than 160,000 former residents of Hong Kong here already who will swell those numbers. But the rule of law, justice, free speech, anything resembling freedom, was snuffed out over more than 60 years in Tibet, has been snuffed out in recent years in Xinjiang, and is now being aggressively snuffed out in Hong Kong. The rule of law does not exist in China, as any of us would recognize it. I just want to give two examples. We had a meeting of the Conservative Human Rights Commission at the beginning of this week and heard testimony from two very brave men who have been the victims of, I won't call it the Chinese justice system because there is no justice. They've fallen foul of the Chinese legal system. One of them was Peter Humphreys, a 67-year-old British citizen from Surrey, who had 48 years of experience with China. He's done a lot of work in China and was working for the GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, when in July 2013, he and his wife were arrested and imprisoned on charges of illegal information gathering after conducting this investigation for GSK. They spent 2 years in Chinese prisons, during which time Peter developed advanced prostate cancer as medical treatment was deliberately withheld in a bid to coerce a false confession. He was the first prominent member of the foreign business community in China to be imprisoned by the Xi Jinping regime, and the case attracted extensive media coverage. He was also the first foreigner to be paraded in a cage on Chinese television in a notorious broadcast of a false and forced TV confession. And Sir George, you may remember back in 2019, there was the case of the Tesco Christmas cards, which gained a lot of attention when a 6-year-old young girl from, I think, Tooting, opened a box of Christmas cards bought in Tesco's to find that one of them had already been filled out. The cards were made in China. On the front, the card featured a kitten and a Santa hat. But inside one of the cards was this message: "We are foreign prisoners in Shanghai Xingpu Prison, China, forced to work against our will. Please help us and notify human rights organizations. Use the link to contact Mr. Peter Humphreys." So Peter was specifically mentioned in that note. From a prisoner in the Gulag, one of many millions who were being forced labor and used by companies in China to sell their goods unsuspectingly to Tesco. And Tesco, to give them their due, ceased business with the company who provided them. The trouble is, it's almost impossible to source where many of these things come from. And we know how so many things are made in China and disguised in various component parts. The second person we heard testimony from earlier this week was a Romanian 42-year-old citizen, Marius Barley. Many of the people in the room were in tears at the testimonies that they gave about their experiences at the hands of the Chinese government. In 2014, Marius was wrongfully arrested along with all the staff of a Chinese company for whom he worked as a part-time employee. The company was accused of contract frauds, which Marius had known absolutely nothing about and was entirely trumped up. He spent the next 2 years in a 12-square-meter cage with no way to contact anyone in the outside world, and a further 6 years in the same Shanghai prison as Peter Humphreys did. This is going on all the time. These two men have been exceedingly brave in not hiding their experiences, but speaking up. And they've done so on behalf of the many other thousands of people in similar situations in Chinese jails and in the Chinese legal system. And we owe them a debt of gratitude as they continue to speak up. It's anticipated that there are something like 5 million prisoners in Chinese jails, of which over 5,000 are estimated to be overseas nationals. We don't know how many of them are British. We don't know what support they are getting from British consular missions. And perhaps the Minister, in responding, can give us the figure on how many British nationals, on top of Jimmy Lai, are in Chinese prisons at the moment and what support they are receiving. I will.
I wonder if you might be so bold as to ask our honourable friend when he gets up to also undertake to say how many are in prison longer than a year, still awaiting trial, because many of these people haven't even had the right to a trial.
Well, that is entirely the point, because it's not just a question of them having dodgy justice.
Yeah.
It's a question of them having to wait years and years, as the 45, I think, who are still going through what's likely to be a 6-month trial, who were in jail restricted of their liberty for many, many months before that. And I think, as he mentioned earlier, there are over 100 people remanded in custody for an average of nearly 22.5 years. So under trumped-up charges, they are incarcerated in pretty grim conditions before they even have a chance to argue their case, if they are given a chance to argue that case, because often the defendants aren't even allowed in court to argue that case. The jury system doesn't exist in many of those cases, and the verdict is predetermined. It turns out that something like 99.9% of all those prosecutions result in a conviction, and 99.9% of appeals against those convictions are turned down. So justice, as I said at the outset, Sir George, does not exist in Hong Kong and the whole of China. There have to be consequences. There has to be consequences when it specifically undermines British interests, when the British agreement has absolutely, in the Foreign Office's own words, been flouted, has been breached, and other nations seem to be taking that breach more seriously than one of the co-signatories of that actual agreement, who has a duty of care to many millions of citizens still in Hong Kong, let alone the increasing number who are escaping its borders. So there is no rule of law. And the cases that I quoted just now, Sir George, predated the national security law, since when things have got much worse. We know that the Chinese do nothing when just faced with a war of words. The only time the Chinese take notice is when there are consequences to those allegations, and governments follow through those consequences. Other nations, particularly the Americans, have followed it through with legislation which has had direct consequences on the ability to trade, for people to travel, on investment, and so on. And it is bizarre and completely unacceptable that we have not followed the American lead on even a fraction of those. So in closing, I just want to give a list of questions, just a few from many, many dozens I could. But before I do, I'm delighted to give way to my right honourable friend.
Can I thank he's giving an excellent speech, and I think what he's reaching for, and would be helpful to know from the government, is what we, the Foreign Office, the UK, is doing to take action. He's mentioned sanctions. The other thing that we can and should do more of, both in relation to Beijing, but also Iran, Russia, and many other countries, when we have people taken effectively as pawns or hostages, is we ought to raise it under the new arbitrary detention mechanism alliance that we pioneered with Canada. And I wonder whether he'd agree with me that sanctions alone, words alone, are not enough. Action in international fora that can embarrass those who take hostages is imperative.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and that is just one of many devices which actually are available to the United Kingdom government, for some reason, none of which they have chosen to take. So let me just give the Minister, and I hope he's got plenty of time to answer these and many other questions that have arisen, just a series of questions. So does the government agree with the findings of the UN Committee Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that the national security law has, I quote, de facto abolished the independence of the judiciary of Hong Kong SAR? Secondly, what steps the government will take to communicate its discontent with China's ongoing breaching of the internationally binding Sino-British Joint Declaration? Not just, you're a bit naughty, we signed this agreement, you don't seem to have stuck to it, would you mind awfully doing something about it? The sort of Dad's Army Sergeant approach to things, would you mind awfully? There has to be consequences. Yes. What are they doing about it? And if the Chinese say nothing, what are we then going to do about it on the basis of that answer? Some more questions. What assessment has the government made over reports that Hong Kong's status as a financial centre is being used to bypass Western sanctions on Russia? What assessment has the government made of UK strategic assets currently being held by the Hong Kong government? What plans has the UK government to review the status of Hong Kong's economic and trade offices in the UK following the enactment of the national security law and the incident at the Chinese consulate in Manchester, which my right honourable friend mentioned, where extraordinarily, not only did the Consular General admit to having beaten up somebody who was protesting outside, no hiding it, it was extraordinary, but then when interviewed on television, said, well, it's my job. So bang to rights. What further evidence was needed? It was on film, in his own words. He'd broken the law. He'd assaulted somebody freely at liberty in the United Kingdom. The government did nothing until he was spirited away by the Chinese government, and then it was too late. 3 other questions, Sir George. What actions is the government taking to protect Hong Kongers now in the UK who face harassment, intimidation and threats from agents of the Chinese Communist Party after that incident in Manchester? Because there are lots of rather scared people around that they're going to have a knock on their door. What steps the government's taking to expand its China expertise within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, including the recruitment of Cantonese and Mandarin speakers? And finally, what support the government is currently offering to UK nationals that have been targeted by the national security law? And I declare an interest because that includes the 7 parliamentarians who have been sanctioned under the national security law, the consequences of which, other than travel and investment, has been banned, but we know not what, for which we have been offered really no protection or added support by the government. And yet the government continues to be willing to meet representatives of that regime and give them publicity as if we were dealing with any other normal democratic nation that actually respects the rule of law. China doesn't. It's not in Hong Kong. This law is appalling. We don't just need to say so. We need to make it clear to the Chinese and that there are consequences from going through with it.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for Chingford and Woodford Green on securing the debate and recognise his determination to keep the issues of persecution in Hong Kong and the government of China's record on human rights more generally as live issues for consideration by this House and for response and action by the UK government. The UK's history as a colonial power in Hong Kong has left a series of moral and legal obligations on this country. The population of Hong Kong, like the populations of many countries around the world, are still living with a legacy of an era and a mindset that saw territories and peoples as the playthings of men who thought themselves so powerful that they could decide the fate of empires from thousands of miles away in the Locarno suite in the map room of King Charles Street. And if that mindset is wrong in the present day, and we rightly condemn strong men and dictatorial regimes who seek to annex or govern territories without democratic mandates, then we must also recognise that that kind of mindset was wrong when it was being exercised by this country in years gone by, and be clear that we intend to learn lessons from the past and resolve to work for democracy, freedom and human rights around the whole world. But as the right honourable member suggested right at the start, even in the complex story of post-colonial transitions, the Sino-British agreement regarding the future of Hong Kong is probably unique. And he was right to stress that of particular relevance to this debate was the agreement between both parties that the economic and social systems in Hong Kong prevailing in 1997 would remain unchanged, as would the rights and freedoms enjoyed by the population, and a commitment that this would last during the 50-year handover period. And this was to be the basis of one country, two systems, and the agreement represented an internationally ratified and binding agreement between the UK and China. And we're now 26 years, just a little more than halfway through that period. But it's very clear from all the contributions to the debate that the pace of change in Hong Kong, particularly with regard to rights and freedoms, is considerably faster and more detrimental to those rights and freedoms than foreseen in the agreement. In short, the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party is not keeping up its end of the bargain. And nowhere is that clearer than in the passing and implementation of the national security law, passed by the Parliament in Beijing, bypassing and without reference to the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. And I'm sure the Minister will be quick to condemn central government for making laws for territories which have established legislative autonomy without consent from the legislatures of those territories. We've heard how comprehensively the law restricts basic rights to freedom of speech and assembly in the name of preserving loosely defined national security in the face of so-called secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. But I thought the member for East Worthing was quite right in his valuable contribution to highlight that this is not really new, and this kind of oppression has been going on for a very long time. And he cited some important case studies in his contribution. But as Amnesty International describes the national security law, the consequences are grave. The undefined nature of key aspects of the law has created fear among people in Hong Kong, putting them at risk of criminal prosecution, removal to the mainland, or deportation from the territory. And we've heard a number of specific case studies where this law has been applied, demonstrating exactly the concerns that were raised when it was passed 3 years ago. And the detention of Cardinal Joseph Zen, along with other humanitarian activists, was of particular concern. As the member for Strangford said, it highlights wider issues around the CCP's attitude to freedom of religion or belief in China. And the ongoing oppression and detention of journalist Jimmy Lee has also been raised by just about everybody, I think, and very powerfully indeed. And a further law, I think, has been passed recently to specifically prevent him from being represented by foreign lawyers. So it's very important that the minister responds to the extremely forceful points that have been made. This man holds a UK passport, and that's supposed to be worth something. And if his the rights, as others have said, if the rights outlined in his passport are diminished, then the rights in all of our passports are diminished, and how we're supposed to travel with confidence is of considerable concern. The US-based Hong Kong Democracy Council says that the only countries incarcerating political prisoners at rates faster than Hong Kong at present are Myanmar and Belarus. Belarus, of course, is a country which sits outside the jurisdiction of the ECHR. So given the special legal and moral responsibilities that the UK government has towards Hong Kong and its people, it really is time for action and not words. So we welcome the establishment of safe and legal routes for people from Hong Kong to come to the UK. Perhaps that's a model that could be applied to other parts of the world for people who are fleeing oppression and have historical or family ties to the UK. And we welcome the UK's acceptance that China is not upholding the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but there clearly is more that has to be done. As the member for East Worthing said, there has to be action. Hong Kong officials known to be violating human rights could be included in the Magnitsky sanctions list. The government could publish an asset of the Hong Kong and Chinese, an asset audit, of the Hong Kong and Chinese officials linked to human rights abuses. It could establish an illicit finance commissioner to monitor the presence of such assets. And as the member for Ashford hinted, they could explain what robust pragmatism actually means. What would it mean to take a more, and what would it require to take a more robust and less pragmatic approach? Perhaps the Minister can say how they expect the economic activity of public bodies overseas matters bill to affect the impact of local authorities and other agencies to use their democratic processes to decide not to buy or invest in activities in China. And again, we had examples of where people might not want to buy goods that have been manufactured in China for various reasons. And can he assure us that no state pension funds are being invested in stocks or bonds of firms complicit in gross human rights abuses? Ministers will have heard these calls repeatedly, and they're clearly paying close attention to them from the SNP benches and from others in the chamber today and in previous debates. And I have no doubt that the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Wood Green and others will continue to turn up the volume on these issues until we see meaningful action from the government.
To serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and also to hear once again an excellent speech from the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green. He has consistently upheld the human rights in Hong Kong and in China more generally. I firmly believe that these debates are strengthened when they're genuinely cross-party, and it's great also to hear the member for Strangford underline the number of women who are affected by the national security legislation which came in 3 years ago this month. We all know that the promised transition to full universal suffrage for the Legislative Committee and the election of the Chief Executive of Hong Kong never materialised, and the protests following that of growing strength have been seen repeatedly since the handover of sovereignty to China in 1997. And it's for that reason that I, with many members here and across the House and in the other place, belong to the Hong Kong Watch committee. And we have originally thought, of course, that this would be a short-lived thing, but unfortunately it goes from strength to strength. because now that we are seeing the continual breaching of the Sino-British agreement, sadly, that Hong Kong Watch Group is ongoing in a necessary way. The effects of the national security legislation cannot be overstated, whereas before the Act was passed, there was at least a vestige of legal separation between the judicial, security and legal systems of Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland, offering a vital buffer and protection for the people of Hong Kong. That effectively has been erased. The people of Hong Kong now live with the knowledge that their wrongdoing, perceived or otherwise in the eyes of Beijing, can see their deportation and detention in the Chinese mainland and away from the few safeguards of liberty which exist in Hong Kong. Now, many members today have mentioned the case of Jimmy Lai, and I think it's very appropriate that we mention that again as a British citizen, British passport holder, and I wonder if the Minister will comment on this particular case in his remarks. I myself have raised it with the Consul, who is based in Hong Kong, when he was here for a visit a couple of months back, and I was given assurances that there is a consular process in place, but I think it would be really helpful if the FCDO could write back to us with an update on how many visits and how regular those visits are and what the findings are of that consular work. We're all mindful as well that a recent Foreign Affairs Select Committee report on the way that British citizens in prison abroad generally are looked after was very critical of the government, Sir George, and I think it would also be helpful in this regard to examine more closely exactly the provision which Jimmy Lai, as a prisoner who was simply using his freedom of expression, how he's getting on and what the Consul General is doing with his team there. Of course.
Thank you very much for giving way. I mean, as part of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, one of the things that does concern us, and one of the things I'm very keen to hear from ministers, is whether they can be more vocal when it comes to the speaking out for British prisoners or political prisoners held abroad. Not only the case of Jimmy Lai, but also the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you.
Before I bring in the Shadow Minister, I do know that the Honourable Gentleman has a express interest in this subject, but it really isn't good to come in right on the end of a debate and do it. No, there's no comeback on it. At the end of a debate and do an intervention, not having listened to the debate. Catherine West. Thank
you very much, Sir George, and I do recognise that members of the Select Committee do have special knowledge, but also your ruling is your ruling. Given this dark backdrop and a noticeable curtailment of their freedoms, again, those which are contained in a legally recognised treaty, it's no surprise that hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers have fled in recent years, with many now calling the UK home. We welcome them here with open arms, and I'm proud of the part that the Labour Party, particularly the Honourable Member for Wigan, as former Shadow Foreign Secretary, and for Aberraven as my predecessor, played in urging the government to amend the rules governing B&O passports, rightly opening up a pathway for citizenships for B&O passport holders and providing hope for a new life away from China's erosion of Hong Kong's way of life. That said, there remains significant concern in the community of Hong Kongers now in the UK that they're still at risk of intimidation from the Chinese government, and I'm afraid to say that the UK government's response to this mounting fear has been woefully lacking, with the Foreign Secretary's response to me in the House the week before last, yet another example of government ministers passing the buck. I've repeatedly raised the need for a true concerted cross-government approach to this growing threat to ensure Hong Kongers and indeed other groups seeking refuge in the UK from the Chinese government are protected, whether they're working or studying or campaigning, and I hope the Minister will address this question in his remarks. That said, while many now make their lives here in the UK, we must give due attention that we should not and indeed cannot turn our backs on those who remain in Hong Kong and consider further erosion of Hong Kong's way of life as a fait accompli. Doing so would turn our backs on British citizens like Jimmy Lai and give carte blanche for further breaches of international law. As a signatory of the Sino-British Agreement, we have a legal, not to mention a moral, duty to continue fighting for the rights promised to Hong Kong until 2047. I'm very pleased that the Foreign Office continues to provide Parliament with a 6-monthly report, but I am concerned that the level of interest has waned, with very little notice being given to the latest release of the report, despite it stating clearly that the government believed China was in a continued state of non-compliance with the Sino-British Agreement, and stating clearly and worryingly that freedom of the press came under increasing pressure. So some asks of the Minister, Sir George. Firstly, and I know the Minister values multilateral engagement, whether he will tell the House what recent discussions ministers have had with allied governments who have also criticised the treatment of Hong Kong and the implementation of the security legislation, specifically the US, Canada and Australia. Secondly, what discussions he's had with British business and multilateral corporations active in the UK on the impact of the legislation on their workforces and the need to ensure BNO passport holders can still gain access to any money or pensions they hold in Hong Kong bank accounts. And I know he will be aware that this has been a specific point raised by a number of members across this House over the last few months. Thirdly, whether he will update the House as to the level of consular access Mr. Lai is receiving, which I mentioned earlier in my speech. And finally, whether the government has given any further consideration of the sanctioning of officials involved in the most repressive aspects of the crackdown on liberty in Hong Kong. I did ask this question of the Minister's colleague, Sir George, who usually deals with this matter, and she did say that the FCDO was looking at the matter of our sanctions being out of kilter with other countries, similar countries. We'll always be united in calling out the Chinese government for its breach of the Sino-British Agreement and the curtailment of liberty in Hong Kong, specifically since the national security legislation was passed. There remain some freedoms available to Hong Kongers, which I am grateful for. But we must be louder, we must be stronger, and we must stand up where bullying occurs. We must condemn what has happened and continue to hold in our thoughts those today who are in prison, political prisoners, by the Chinese government. Thank you, Sir George.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for calling for this debate and for all the work he does indeed in this area. And I'm also grateful to other honourable and right honourable members for their important contributions today. Those members from Strangford, Ashford, East Worthing and Shoreham, Glasgow North, and of course the opposition front bench, my honourable friend from Hornsey and Wood Green. And of course this has been a lively debate, and I should say, of course, that I'm answering on behalf of my right honourable friend, the member for Berwick-upon-Tweed, who is currently engaged on other parliamentary duties. But I am grateful for the contributions of all colleagues today, and I will try and cover off the many questions asked in my remarks that follow. Of course, as we've been discussing today, the imposition 3 years ago, following the widespread protests that members have recalled, Beijing imposed the national security law in Hong Kong, and the UK, along with international partners, George, made immediately clear our strong objection to this law. We declared its imposition as a further breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which China willingly signed up to in 1984. And of course, the crackdown that accompanied the national security law has changed Hong Kong forever. 3 years on, we have seen how this opaque and sweeping law has undermined rights and freedoms enshrined in the Joint Declaration, and indeed Hong Kong's own basic law. And Hong Kong's governance, rights and social systems are now much closer to mainland norms, and the autonomy promised under one country, two systems has been eroded. Hong Kong is less politically autonomous than at any time since the handover. Hong Kong authorities, under the direction of Beijing, have targeted critical voices across Hong Kong society, as we've heard today. And as members have highlighted, those facing prosecution include former political leaders, pro-democracy figures, and members of Hong Kong civil society, trade unions, and media outlets. Many of those arrested in 2019 and 2020 are only going on trial now. A panel of judges who are hand-selected by Hong Kong's chief executive hears these cases. And as they progress through the court, new legal precedents will be established, shaping the future rule of law in Hong Kong, which is deeply worrying. Now, of course, one of the main figures is indeed Jimmy Lai, whose case has been discussed extensively today. He was one of Hong Kong's most successful businessmen and a former publisher of Apple Daily. Mr. Lai has been prosecuted on multiple fronts in an obvious attempt to silence and discredit him. Mr. Lai is a British dual national. He's a British passport holder. Of course, he has never rescinded his Chinese nationality, and that, of course, has a bearing on this case. He is a British dual national. He has never rescinded his Chinese nationality. And delighted to give way.
This is a very important point. He is not a dual national. His family has made that clear. He has one passport, one citizenship. It is British. He does not have any reference now to any dual nationality whatsoever. Would the government please stop
Minister.
calling this out?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. My understanding from officials is that Mr. Lai has never rescinded his Chinese nationality, and we therefore refer to him as a British dual national. But of course, we care very deeply about his case. And we are raising Mr. Lai's detention with the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities at every opportunity, making clear our objections to these politically driven prosecutions. The Foreign Secretary did so with Chinese Vice President Han Zheng in May, and we have set out our concerns at the highest levels in Hong Kong. Our diplomats in Hong Kong have attended Mr. Lai's court proceedings since his arrest in 2020 and will continue to do so. The Minister for the Indo-Pacific has met with Mr. Lai's son Sebastian and their international legal team, and officials continue to support them. Mr. Lai's national security trial is due to start in September, and we will, of course, monitor it exceptionally closely and continue to press for consular access. Of course, Mr. Lai's is not the only significant case, as we've heard today, and Hong Kong's largest national security trial is ongoing, with 47 former pro-democracy activists and politicians facing allegations of so-called subversion. These cases and others demonstrate in the starkest way the national security law is being used to stifle dissent. And as to possible numbers and whether or not that includes any British nationals, I will ask my colleague, the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, to write to clarify that to the Honourable Member for Chingford to clarify. So, of course, the national security law has damaged Hong Kong's media landscape irrevocably. And I commend the recent report published by the All Party Group for Hong Kong, highlighting the parlous state of media freedom there. A city that was once ranked 18th in the World Press Freedom Index now sits close to the bottom at 140 out of 180 countries. And the Chinese government undertook to protect press freedom and freedom of speech in Hong Kong under the Joint Declaration of Basic Law and allegedly the national security law. Yet outlets such as Apple Daily and Stan News have been forced to close. Their publishers and journalists face national security charges for being critical of the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities' agenda. And we will always defend media freedom and the right of journalists to do their job. So, of course, the UK responded rapidly and decisively to the imposition of the national security law as a demonstration of our commitment to Hong Kong and its people. As has been described today, we opened our doors to the people of Hong Kong looking for a home and created a bespoke visa route. We have now granted more than 160,000 applications made by British national overseas wishing to come to the UK through this route. My right honourable friend, Member for Ashford, asked about the prospect of their political involvement and whether they should be debarred from being MPs. And I will ask my colleague, the Minister, to write, because that's an interesting point. Now, of course, we are steadfast in our support of the Hong Kong diaspora and committed to ensuring their successful integration into local communities. We will not tolerate any attempt by any foreign power to intimidate, harass or harm individuals or communities in the UK. The Defending Democracy Task Force in the Home Office under the Security Minister is reviewing the UK's approach to transnational repression to ensure the response across government and law enforcement is robust and joined up. Now, of course, in the broader context, we have suspended the UK-Hong Kong extradition treaty indefinitely and extended to Hong Kong the arms embargo applied to mainland China since 1989. Meanwhile, we do alert British nationals and businesses, that was raised today, to the impact of the national security law and to the risks it poses in our travel advice and overseas business risk guidance on the UK government. Now, Sir George, the Foreign Secretary made clear our position on China in his speech at Mansion House in April. We will work with China where our interests converge, while steadfastly defending our national security and our values. It is the role of the Foreign Secretary and ministers to engage foreign governments, including those with whom we disagree. And of course, when Lord Johnson visited, I should say to colleagues that he did, in local media, speak out against the erosion of rights and freedoms in Hong Kong. Time is tight, and I want to come back to the minister, my honourable friend, so he can wind up. But of course, with regard to the extensive list of very valid questions raised by the Honourable General for Worthing and Shoreham, I will ask my friend, the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, to write addressing his commendable list of questions, and also those from the leader of the debate with regard to the national security and any prospect of any energy deal. So I will ask my friend, the Minister, to write to confirm the answers for those. But I should say, in closing, Sir George, the UK will continue to stand up for the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers and the autonomy Hong Kong was promised. Thank you.
Ian Duncan-Smith for a very brief summary.
So, George, I understand that I've got just over a minute and I will be brief. Can I just say to my honourable friend who's just answered from the government standpoint, I understand he had less time perhaps than we might have hoped, but that notwithstanding, I do hope he will follow up and answer the questions that we asked, not least of which I have to say to him was the question of being steadfast is one thing, but taking action is another. So I would recommend they move from robust pragmatism to just robust action. And that is the point of sanctions. Why have we not sanctioned any single person from the administration in the imposition of the national security law? That is a consequence that China will lift their heads up to. And I want to finish very simply on this single point. Jimmy Lai is a British passport holder and citizen. The government, every time they refer to him as a dual national, plays into the hands of the Chinese government, who do not recognize dual nationality. I wish we would stop this nonsense. The price of freedom is very high, but the price of no freedom is even higher. We are a British government believing in democracy and freedom. It is time we told the Chinese government there are consequences when you strip freedom away from people and their rights.
Order. Order. I now call Virginia Crosby to move the motion, and then I will call the Minister to respond. There will be no opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as the convention is, it doesn't exist for 30 minutes debates. Victoria Crosby.
Virginia, actually. It's Virginia Crosby.
Sorry?
It's Virginia Crosby.
So I do apologise. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay, Sir George. It's a pleasure to introduce this debate today, Mr. Chairman, on Great British Nuclear. Quite simply, the formation of Great British Nuclear, headed up by the interim CEO and brilliant Gwen Parry-Jones, who lives on Anglesey, has given us the best opportunity in 40 years to kickstart a programme of new nuclear power stations in this country. I'd like to remind those members here, if they need reminding, that nuclear is vital to our journey to net zero. It's vital to our drive for energy security, and it is vital to our prosperity as a country, with jobs and opportunity reaching every corner of these islands. In just one technology, nuclear provides energy that's clean, it's reliable, it's affordable, and it's British. It's the only technology that can say that. Common sense and every bit of modelling and evidence from countries right around the world tells us that we need nuclear, operating whatever the weather, to complement technologies like wind and solar, and to wean us off imported fossil fuels. I'll take your intervention.
Lady Brennan Small for bringing forward. From the very beginning, when the Honourable Lady came to this House, Sir George, her interest in her constituency and in nuclear power has been prominent, and I congratulate her for that. Does the Honourable Lady not agree that the war in Ukraine with the accompanying fuel crisis has underlined the vital importance of nuclear capacity, and that £20 billion for a large-scale plant with additional support for small modular reactors for a plant that helps self-sufficiency for this nation is a price that we must be willing to pay. I've always supported nuclear, support the Honourable Lady here today.
May I thank the honourable member for his intervention. He's a true champion for his constituency and certainly for the nuclear sector, and thank him for his kind words. I absolutely agree with you. We have to invest in this new technology. The time is now. It's important for our net zero. It's important for all those fantastic jobs, and we cannot achieve net zero without it. We need that energy security. Nuclear's record in local communities speaks for itself. High quality, long-term skilled jobs that are paying wages 2 or 3 times what people are getting outside of that power station. My community and many others around the UK who've had nuclear power know that it delivers good quality jobs and local investment. And so they want more of it. That, as members may guess, is my particular interest in the debate today. We've made great progress in recent years in nuclear, introducing the new regulated asset-based funding model, investing in Sizewell C, putting money into the Rolls-Royce reactor design. The Chancellor's very welcome announcement that we will green label nuclear, and crowned, of course, by the formation of Great British Nuclear. We even have, for the very first time, our very own nuclear minister. I can attest to the wave of energy and optimism that GPN's formation has given to the industry. And the Minister will know how technology vendors and developers from all over the world have entered the small modular reactor down selection process that GB is running at the moment. Many of them have come to visit Wilver in my constituency of Ynys to see the best site in the UK for further nuclear development. The likes of GE Hitachi, Rolls-Royce and Last Energy have all toured the island. That is what I want to focus on today, how GBN can convert reactor technologies, sites and strong political support from the government into new projects in constituencies like Ynys Môn. Minister, I hope you're listening carefully. If I start with the SMR down selection, we should expand the prize of winning. At the moment, the prize is co-funding to help development the winning technologies up to the point of a final investment decision. This is a good start, but we can go further. The winners should get access to named sites that are suitable for building SMRs, access to a funding model like the regulated asset-based model or contracts for difference to help raise money, and help from GBN to form the actual project companies that will develop, own and operate the nuclear power stations once they're built. The first SMR being built in the Western world at Darlington in Ontario, Canada, followed exactly this model. Ontario Power Generation ran a selection process like we're running now about 5 years ago. And at the start, they were clear. They were clear that whoever won the selection would build them an SMR at the Darlington site, and that they, as Ontario Power Generation, would develop, own and operate the site. So the winners had a site, the winners had an order, and the winners had a project developer and operator. That is the model we should follow, because that is how we give investors enough confidence to put their money into these projects. And I'm delighted that the Energy Bill gives GBN the powers to form subsidiaries and joint ventures with the private sector to do exactly this type of individual project development. And I'd like to hear from the Minister how his department will support GBN in doing just that. But more than that, I'd like to hear from the Minister if he's thought about awarding sites and offering funding modes to the winners to accelerate the process of deployment and to quicken investor interest in the UK. If he needs sites to offer, I have one in mind. The best site for new nuclear in the UK, Wilver. Our need for new nuclear, of course, means that we have to build more large-scale nuclear as well as small-scale nuclear. Large-scale nuclear, often unfairly maligned, has actually had a banner year. All 3 major Western designs, the EPR, the AP1000, the APR1400, have connected reactors and entered commercial operation. Coincidentally, I think that the owners of those designs have all expressed an interest in the Wilver site. And I'd like to hear from the Minister what more thinking has been done about further large-scale projects after Sizewell C to capitalise on this interest. And if he would set out his thinking on the circumstances under which we will pursue more large-scale nuclear in this country. Of course.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate on a very important issue that will hopefully help to secure Britain's future energy security. On the issue of Sizewell C, one of the challenges that we found in Suffolk, and I think this will be reflected across the country, is the failure of EDF in this particular case to properly engage with many communities in Suffolk about very legitimate and easily accommodated concerns related to the construction of the plant. I just wonder what would she suggest to the Minister could be done to make sure that when future nuclear plants are brought forward, that actually we can have a better type of engagement.
The honourable member makes an excellent point. One of the reasons why nuclear sites are successful is to have the support of the local community. That is absolutely vital. And we see that with these development consent orders, these for planning, and we've seen that with Wilver, and we've seen that certainly down in Hinckley. It's absolutely vital that the companies engage with the local residents. The Minister will know from the experience of Hinkley Point C, nearly 10,000 jobs on site, supporting over 3,000 jobs throughout the construction period, with companies based in Wales, and 850 million is expected to be spent throughout the Welsh supply chain during construction. There are 22,000 people working across the country and more than £5 billion spent across the region. What a prize a large-scale project is for a local community, and I'd ask to pursue large-scale development with equal vigour to SMRs. I know, of course, that there is the issue of money. I'm convinced that the private sector is willing and able to invest in nuclear if they know that the UK government is standing right behind them, and nuclear projects as well. The planning, the regulation, the site access and the funding models on offer are all within his gift, or within the government's gift. So I'm sure he'll see why investors are keen to see ministers stand by projects, as they've done with Sizewell C. And that is my request to him, that GBN is able to offer the Sizewell C model, regulated asset-based funding, a government support package, and a 20% government direct stake in the project to the next 2 projects the government targets to get to FID in the next Parliament, and to all future projects. That certainly would be a godsend to investors and give real hope to communities like mine that new projects will get off the ground. I'll end on this note, if I may. We've been talking actively about new nuclear at Wilver on the island for 15 years and more. It has not happened. It's been very difficult for the local community to deal with that disappointment and to still put their confidence in nuclear as a way to create opportunities for the young people on the island. But they still do put their confidence in nuclear. They still do want projects to come with the investment and the jobs that that will bring. They look to me and they look to the Minister and to his colleagues to get it done. I simply ask him to return the faith that they have put in us and help us get new nuclear at Wilver over the line. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, George. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And my goodness me, an absolute pleasure to be here discussing nuclear with my friend, the Honourable Member for Innismon. The passion that she brings to this debate is unmatched, and the word champion, the term champion, is bandied about a lot in this building, but she genuinely is one of the greatest champions for nuclear, and indeed an incredible champion for her constituency and its interests here in Parliament. It has been ever since she arrived here in late 2019. The Honourable Lady has an impressive track record of championing her constituency. I've said to remain at the heart of decisions on the future of nuclear power, the investment that it could bring, and the jobs it could create, both locally and indeed across the United Kingdom. I will continue to encourage government and Great British Nuclear to engage with communities like hers who are considering whether their land might be suitable for the deployment of nuclear facilities in the near future. The invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent rise in global energy prices have demonstrated the paramount importance of accelerating homegrown power and strengthening our national energy security. And I think the member for Strangford put it better than I ever could when he made the similar contribution during this debate. This is in addition to the significant contribution that nuclear could bring to achieving our net zero objectives. As part of our response, the government has committed to ensuring that the UK is one of the best places in the world to invest in civil nuclear power, and is taking the steps to revitalise the UK's nuclear industry. Last year alone, the government made an historic investment of £700 million and became a shareholder in the Sizewell C project in support of our long-standing objective to take a large-scale nuclear project to the point of final investment decision in this Parliament, subject to all relevant approvals. And I do hear that, yes, I was about to reference him, but I
thank the Minister for giving way, but he'll also be aware that the Secretary of State overruled some of the concerns that were picked up as part of the development control process in supporting Sizewell C to go ahead. Now, whilst I think most of us accept the importance of investment in projects like Sizewell C, one of the main concerns that arose from that was the failure of EDF to engage with legitimate concerns across Suffolk and Suffolk's communities in the construction process and the eventual build of Sizewell C. And I just wonder, what reassurance can he give to residents that lessons will be learned from that?
I thank the honourable member for his contribution, and I would like to maybe give this reassurance in that I made it a priority of mine to visit the Sizewell C site, not just to see the site and meet with EDF and Sizewell C company, but also to hear from and engage with local communities, including those who have got concerns about the Sizewell C project and indeed about the way that the consultation exercise was run and engagement with the companies involved. I look forward to continuing my engagement with those individuals and communities who are concerned about this project moving forward and who also have concerns about the vast number of critical national infrastructure projects that will be being built in and around the honourable gentleman's constituency moving forward. Critical pieces of national infrastructure, but in doing so, in delivering this new investment in our grid and this incredible investment at Sizewell C, it is absolutely vital that we take communities with us and that they feel that they have had a say in the process of getting to the final decision on whether or not to proceed. So I give my commitment here today that I will continue to meet with the groups concerned and will do so right up until the point that there are spades in the ground at Sizewell, and indeed whoever my successor is will do the same. The British Energy Security Strategy set out our ambition for deploying up to 24 gigawatts of nuclear power by 2050, which would be 25% of our projected 2050 electricity demand, including 2 new nuclear projects taking final investment decisions in the next Parliament. We also announced the creation of Great British Nuclear, GBN, which will be an arm's-length responsible body for driving delivery of new nuclear projects backed with the funding that it needs. GBN will be at the heart of a pragmatic approach that will give industry and investors the confidence necessary to deliver projects at pace, reducing costs through learning and replication. Earlier this year, the Powering Up Britain publication set out our plans for GBN to launch a competitive selection process for choosing the best small modular reactor, that's SMR technologies, here in the UK. In April, GBN launched the first phase of this process in the form of a market engagement exercise. The second phase, which is the down selection process, will be launched over the summer with an ambition to assess and decide on the leading technologies by autumn. The government will provide co-funding to be deployed by GBN to support the development of these selected technologies and will work with successful bidders on ensuring the right financing and site arrangements are in place in line with its commitment to progress projects in the next Parliament. The total level of development funding will be subject, obviously, to future spending reviews, and I hear the suggestions from my honourable friend, the member for Innismon, and I will take those back to the GBN board as we move forward. In addition, GBN will work with government on access to potential sites for new nuclear projects to achieve our long-term ambition. This reflects our collective awareness of the growing local and regional interest in a number of sites for further nuclear development. We intend to publish a consultation in 2023 as a first step towards the development of the new national policy statement for nuclear to ensure our approach remains resilient to the needs of achieving net zero. I can assure my right honourable friend that community engagement will be central to the development of projects at each site. Developers will need to work with the host authorities and communities, statutory bodies, and other key stakeholders to shape the proposals that would ultimately inform statutory consultation requirements and an application for a development consent order. Further engagement will also be undertaken as part of the wider regulatory processes to be completed prior to the construction and operation of a new power station. The government recognises the strong interest and support for nuclear power across North Wales. The government is also aware of the potential of the Wilfa site, which is included in the National Policy Statement for new nuclear power. Looking ahead, both Great British Nuclear and the National Policy Statement team would welcome any conversations with stakeholders who are considering whether their land might be suitable for the deployment of nuclear facilities in the future. And of course, GBN will also support the government's consideration of further large gigawatt-scale projects to help us deliver on our net zero ambitions. Our commitment to a nuclear programme and to GBN will put the UK on a path to achieving its ambition and to become a global leader in civil nuclear power and SMRs, which could include the creation of high-value jobs and the development of our capabilities. And so I'd like to close by thanking my honourable friend for securing this very important debate, and I look forward to visiting Innismon and continuing to engage with her and other stakeholders in the future.
The question is that this House has considered British nuclear As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.
Very good. Cheers, Virginia. I hope that's okay. Okay, cool. No worries.